Okay. All right, good morning, and welcome to the CannabizMD Cannabis Science and Policy Forum. I'm Jacquie Cohen Roth, as all of you in this room know. I'm the founder and CEO of CannabizMD and then nonprofit TPAD. I'm exceptionally pleased to have you join here today in Boston and to the folks on Zoom. It's an exciting time for CannabizMD as we flourish simultaneously with the medical cannabis industry in the U.S., where we have 38 states having a medical cannabis program, 3 U.S. territories, and Washington, D.C. having some version of a medical cannabis program. There additionally are 23 states, not all up and operational, that have an adult use industry that actually impacts the medical industry that we're going to be talking about throughout the program today. Backstory in CannabizMD, I founded it in 2017, whereas I transitioned out of the conventional healthcare space, and I had recognized that there was a need and an opportunity for a platform that was focused on advancing cannabis science and policy education, particularly for physicians, the healthcare stakeholders, folks in and in the industry. Welcome. Good morning. And with that, I was a bit clever on my branding with CannabizMD, launching in Maryland's market that just went live December 2017. And recognized that the nascent medical cannabis program in Maryland needed support. That's the double entendre, the MD, but my focus is on medical and certainly speak to adult use when it comes into play and intersects with the medical program. And my companies, both the CannabizMD and the nonprofit TPAD, are founded on a Hebrew principle, tikkun olam, which literally means repair of the world. We are here collectively to do that and filling this very necessary void, or not a necessary void, but the void that does exist with cannabis science and policy education, where a data point that I regularly reference is we have approximately 6 million registered certified medical cannabis patients in the US. Meanwhile, we have, maybe it's a bit more now, but per a study that was released a couple years ago, about 9% of US medical schools include cannabis science, endocannabinoid science in their curriculum. If we would have full legality of a medical program across the US, data points that I figured out using a metric that states use to determine the potential for medical cannabis patients anywhere from 2 to 4%. That means that we would have 9 million patients in the US. Lump those in with folks that are using hemp-derived cannabinoids that we're going to be speaking about, and of course the illicit market. So as I say, it's highly likely that a healthcare provider has somebody in their practice using cannabis in some form. Meanwhile, they're not educated. 67% of physicians say that that they're not comfortable speaking to their patients. They don't have the knowledge and the expertise. And unfortunately, the model now is that folks are going into, whether it's an adult use dispensary or medical dispensary, and they're getting their education from a dispensary attendee, which is completely backwards, as I say. So that's why we're here today. The medical cannabis industry, as we know, those of us that are in the room and work in it, is incredibly dynamic. It functions like no other industry. We're operating in a federally illegal industry with a patchwork of state regulations across the country. This industry is dynamic and, as we know, quite challenging. But we're here. What we're here to do is to inspire each other, educate each other with an industry at the same time that is ancient, 5,000 years old. Folks have been using plant-based medicine and cutting edge that we're going to be addressing in one of our final roundtable, Innovation Emerging Trends. Throughout the day, you're going to be hearing from our experts, and we'll have the opportunity to question these folks. The model is that each roundtable is going to last about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A that folks in the room. We're going to have you fully engaged in the program, and then folks on Zoom will also be fully engaged in the program. I have a couple of housekeeping notes. And some really critical thank yous. Firstly, I'd like to thank a group of people that I met through the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, Medical Cannabis Science and Therapeutics program. I'm a proud member of the first class. I refer to it as the guinea pig class, an in vivo study on how this is going to fly. And so there are some ladies in the room that if you'd raise your hand that graduated, what, a month ago? And congratulations to you. So that's Dr. Michelle Jordan, who's managing Zoom. McKenna Campbell, who is still outside supporting with registration. Karen James and Jenny Schroeder. And thank you so much for your support. Also, I don't see him in the room, is Carl Coble, who is a very dedicated TPAD advisory board member, and he's essentially been an ops manager here. Very grateful to his work. Lastly, and I'm very excited to introduce, and I'm going to choke up, is Emily Jacobs. Emily Jacobs put in a year of incredible work as the very best CannabizMD intern while she was in graduate school, working full-time as a nurse and raising 3 beautiful children. I'm very excited to share that Emily now is the director of content for CannabizMD and is putting in a tremendous amount of sweat equity as we lift and grow a 5-year-old company, and she's helping me execute the dreams that I've had for this company. So thank you to Emily. For our sponsors, very grateful to the sponsors that have supported the program and help execute. We have our silver sponsor, TrueLeaf, and Laura Niehaus is in the room, and she's on one of the panels. Very grateful for the support that TrueLeaf has given to CannabizMD as well as TPAD. TrueLeaf has been exceptional in helping me, CannabizMD, everybody involved, and to help fill that void of cannabis science and policy education. Very grateful to TrueLeaf, as well as TrueLeaf's focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the industry. So thank you very much, Lauren. To Foley Hoeg, Kevin Conroy. Very grateful to have Foley Hoeg as such a tremendous partner, both for the CannabizMD Forum and TPAD. The team that I've worked with has just been exceptional, and I don't think we'd be able to execute such a program that we have today without them. So thank you very much. Then we have our breakfast sponsor, Wana Brands, and very excited to have Mike Hennessy, who I met in graduate school. He's also in that guinea pig class, and you'll be hearing from Mike later on the innovation and emerging trends. And then we have the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, who has also supported their program and obviously share this commitment to cannabis science and policy education as the very first university to launch a graduate level program in our field. And of course, to gratuity to our speakers, who we've had a number of emails go back and forth. I've hosted Zoom meetings with all of you, engaging you. I wouldn't be here without Dr. Tishler, who was our keynote speaker back in September, and he said, bring this to Boston. And so we are here today doing that. So the housekeeping notes, the forum is being recorded and will be shared with everybody within the next couple of weeks once we go through and edit that. Dr. Jordan is managing the forum chat for those of you that are joining us on Zoom, and that is a space for you to network in a polite and cordial professional manner. And the Zoom chat, we will be engaging those folks on Zoom with Q&A again with every discussion that we have. We're going to be taking a break for lunch at about 12 o'clock. We'll be back at 1. If you're joining us at Zoom, that's a time for you to take a break. And please, of course, network. We're going to take a second break at 3, from 3 to 3:15, which will bring us back for the fourth and final roundtable. Everybody has a program book that one of the very delighted, pleased, proud of the program book that, of course, outlines our agenda. But we've reached out to all of our speakers, and in the program book is a quote from every single speaker on what this industry means, what they're doing in this space. And so, as we know, those of us that are working in this industry, it is probably the most complex industry on the planet at this time. It's 3 industries in one. We have cultivation, which is agriculture. We have processing, which is manufacturing. Of course, we have retail, which is the dispensary. The medical cannabis industry also includes the knowledge assets, as I say, and the integration of 4 different industries. So we owe a great deal to our legacy industry, and that includes the powerful advocates, many of whom are the patients back in the early 90s that led legalization in cannabis as with the AIDS epidemic, and certainly the mothers of cannabis, of children who have been suffering terrible seizure disorders, and how cannabis has been so effective for them. And so we owe a great bit of a gratuity to those folks. And then we also have the conventional healthcare space that I've spoken about. We have technology that, again, we're going to be transitioning and speaking to in the last forum. And those that are not in the industry have no idea of the complexity of this industry that moves so quickly and rapidly, and that everybody has to be ready quickly to pivot to address if there's a new state regulation, if we've got something coming down the pike for federal regulatory. And then again, we do have the impact of the pharmaceutical industry, and engaging with the pharmaceutical industry of what they have done thus far as supporting any of the studies, which of course are very insignificant in numbers and what we need. We're going to be talking about that in our federal regulatory conversation. So this is a complex industry with a patchwork of state regulations, and each state having its own set of regulations. So we're going to be walking through the industry. Again, first we have that the clinical roundtable, where we're going to be talking about the scientific and clinical applications of cannabis, medical cannabis. Secondly, we're going to have the federal regulatory roundtable. Then we flow into the state regulatory roundtable, and again, lastly, the innovation and emerging trends. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Kevin Conroy, is going to say a few words and welcome you here.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kevin Conroy. I'm a partner at Foley Hoag. First housekeeping thing. We hesitate to have conferences in this room because the view behind you is so good that you sometimes lose focus as to what's going on here. So by all means, I'll speak very quickly. You can look now if you want, and you can look during the breaks. But when real expert speakers get up, make sure you keep the focus here. Welcome to Foley Hoag. We're really happy to have this conference today. This is a great conference. We're very excited about the speakers. We got into the cannabis business as a law firm in 2016. As you know, I measure my life in cannabis in dog years. So we're a very mature cannabis firm. I won't say old, but a very mature cannabis firm. We are a full service law firm. We have non-cannabis clients, if you will believe that. And we have offices in Washington and New York and Denver. And so we open up our offices around where we think are very strong cannabis markets. That's an important factor in what we do. We do IP work, we do real estate work. You'll hear from me later on state regulatory issues, and you will hear from one of my partners later on federal issues, Bryant Godfrey. We are really excited that you're here today. Bathrooms are behind you out there. There are bathrooms on the 17th floor. People can direct you. We also have a couple colleagues who will be around. If there's anything we can do to make your day here, you need a conference room, you need something like that, please let us know. We're happy to be hospitable. You got the coffee. Looks like everything is going in the right direction. Have a great day.
So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jordan Tishler as our keynote speaker. Dr. Tishler is a cannabis specialist. Through his training in internal medicine and years of practice as an emergency physician, he brings his knowledge, reason, and caring to patients through his advocacy work at both the state, at the local and national levels. Dr. Tishler graduated from both Harvard College and Harvard Medical School. He trained at Brigham and Women's Hospital and is at faculty at both Brigham and Women's Hospital as well as Harvard Medical School. He has spent several years working with the underserved, particularly providing care for veterans. Having treated countless patients harmed by alcohol and drugs, his observation that he had never seen a cannabis overdose led him to delve deeply and personally into the science of cannabis safety and treatment. Dr. Tishler is a frequent speaker and author on a variety of topics related to the medical applications of cannabis. He's also president of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, which has a similar focus shared by CannabizMD to educate clinicians, lawmakers, and the industry about best practices and necessary tools for proper patient care. Welcome, Dr. Tishler.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming today. I'm Jordan. Thank you, Jackie, for the wonderful introduction, for putting this phenomenal event together again. And thank you to the sponsors for their support. I need to be able to see. Oh, I guess I can see. You know, you'd think that after all these years of doing these kinds of public presentations that I would sort of be calm about it, but I'm not. I'm totally bouncing around. It's not the caffeine. I didn't drink caffeine. So bear with me as I try to focus for you guys. We've certainly heard a lot already about the cannabis industry and the challenges that we're all facing. I want to talk today particularly about where we see things needing to go on the federal level and how we may get there. So hence the conversation is entitled Patients and Legalization, where do we go from here? And I think the subtitle is probably more important, which is why do we need a more medical system? So you've heard a bunch about me already. I tend to run through this list largely when I'm talking to colleagues outside the cannabis world to convince them that I haven't completely lost my marbles. The key, you know, in this long list of my background really is to understand that my background until 10, 12 years ago was, we would call, very conventional, right? I went through Harvard 3 times over, hence we say preparation H. And then I went and worked for the VA for 15 years as an emergency room physician. And when Massachusetts started talking about medical cannabis as a ballot initiative, I think I, like many of my colleagues, said, huh, what are you talking about? What do you mean medical cannabis? But I also had, as Jackie mentioned, this sort of aha moment where I said, you know, my entire practice here in the ER is either patients who have been harmed by substances or patients who are here for a medical problem, but it's complicated by substances, right? And, you know, if we were looking at the top 10 list of those substances, everybody thinks, oh, opioids. It was alcohol 1 through 9, with maybe opioids and benzos kind of at the bottom as a footnote. Alcohol, alcohol, alcohol. And it was truly disheartening. But I went, you know, I thought, oh, well, look, if I'm not seeing people coming through the emergency room sick from cannabis, that tells me something about its toxicity. So if it's not super toxic, like alcohol is, maybe I should learn something about it. Way back then, there were politicians like Mrs. Clinton running around saying, well, it sounds like a nice idea, but there's no data. You may remember at that time, if you stuck the word cannabis into PubMed, you'd get nothing, only 25,000 studies. 25,000 studies is a daunting number. I actually really, in retrospect, have no idea how it is I weeded through, pun intended, all of those studies to come up with some sort of comprehensive thought process. But I did, and it took me several years, and I came away from that really feeling like, yes, there are data here, and we can make informed and rational treatment decisions for our patients. But we also have to treat this like a medicine and not like, just a goof, because anything that works also has potential downside and risks. So that sort of launched me into thinking about this. I started my private practice because, not that this was ever on my agenda. I never wanted to be in private practice, but that was the vehicle, right? I worked for the VA. They weren't going to let me do this. At that time, there was even a gag order. I also worked for Harvard and the affiliated hospitals, who get all of their support through the federal government in one way or another. So they weren't going to let me do it. So I started the private practice. And then I spend most of my time giving talks like this, or going back to my colleagues and trying to help them understand cannabis as a medicine and their need to get educated and more involved. And that then led me to the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, which is really it's an international not-for-profit that's focused on education for clinicians, as well as education for lawmakers, so that we can progress the care for patients and the tools that are necessary for clinicians to be able to provide that care. Just as a point of full disclosure, I do some consulting work for two companies at the moment, Troche and a company called Clutch Cannabis, none of which have anything to do with today's talk. So we've heard a bit about all of the states that have various medical or recreational programs. This is a slide just to remind us that, frankly speaking, most of the country at this point is some form of green or yellow. It's vast. And we've also heard a lot of discussion about it being a real patchwork. And I think when we look at this slide, that sort of is well illustrated. We ultimately need to go beyond this into something that makes a little bit more coherent sense. This is the classification chart of the Controlled Substances Act. It's really here just to remind us that Schedule 1, where cannabis resides, is inappropriate. All right, by its own definition of substances that significant harm and significant risk of addiction, coupled with no medical use. Well, we're all here knowing full well that there is medical use, and yes, there are risks of harm associated with cannabis, but that doesn't mean that it belongs in the forbidden category. So we need to move that. There's a lot of debate about where that should land, and we could talk about that more. So here are some quotations that kind of illustrate the problems that we're facing at the moment from a patient point of view. So I don't know what your doctor is talking about. Don't listen to him. I'll tell you what to do. These are actual quotations. I didn't make these up. These are things my patients have told me. And this, unfortunately, was from a patient who got a lot of advice at the dispensary that was contrary to what I had suggested to him, and ultimately, unfortunately, didn't do very well with those products and came back to me wondering what was going on. They kept trying to get me to buy more. They have volume deals and push other products. And what's up with a prize wheel? This isn't the Price is Right. Here in Massachusetts, at least, one of the odd things in our regulations is that deals are allowed. And so there is this continual idea that, at least on the medical side, that they will put these volume deals together, and that it's supposed to lower the prices for patients. But what it ultimately does is it increases the amount that they purchase. And the more they purchase, the more they use. And oftentimes that's very contrary to their medical best practices. He told me to add this keef stuff to my vaporizer, and now I feel sick, doctor. Why? This is, again, unfortunately, a real story where a gentleman was given this advice, and I had said, take 1-2 puffs on your flower machine after you put a strain that's 15 to 20% THC in there, knowing that this guy was going to get somewhere between 5 and 10 milligrams of THC, which would be appropriate. But then you add 50% THC with keef, and now you're at 65-ish%, right? So unfortunately, his care was significantly derailed by this experience, not simply because he had a bad experience, but because he then developed a mistrust, right, of the cannabis industry, thankfully not of me, but also of the medicine. And it took me quite a long time of working with him to get him to be able to come back around to a comfort zone where then we could proceed and get him the care that he needed. You were right, doctor. They immediately suggested CBD. It's a good thing you warned me about how dangerous this could be for me. This was kind of an interesting scenario because within the space of a week, I saw 2 gentlemen completely unrelated to each other that both came in for what seemed like routine back pain. The thing was that made these 2 gentlemen interesting is they both had transplants. One had had a liver transplant, one had had a kidney transplant. And so as a result of having transplanted organs, they were on these very important, very powerful, and very dangerous immunosuppressant medications that they need, because if they don't take it, they lose the organ, right? Turns out that CBD interacts tremendously with these particular set of medications, but I knew that if they went into a dispensary and they said, what do you got for back pain? They were going to get handed a bottle of CBD. And that's exactly what happened. So I thankfully headed that off. But again, it speaks to the fact that there is more complexity and more risk than than we can handle in the current system. Nerves, not weed. The current dispensing system is good for the industry. Now, let me start out by saying I don't have a problem with industry. I'm very supportive of it, but I do think we have to do a better job of it. And unfortunately, at current, we see a lot of misdirection at the point of sale, a lot of upselling tactics, and a lot of false claims. There's inadequate medical knowledge, and I think ultimately, that's not the dispensary's issue. That is to say, I don't think we can develop dispensaries or expect the frontline agents at the dispensary to have any amount of training short of going to nursing or medical school that will put them in a position where they have adequate medical knowledge. And unfortunately, we also have to recognize that there is a conflict of interest, right? That their job is to sell cannabis, and more cannabis is better. But that's not necessarily in keeping with what's best for the patient. And that it is really my contention that it is in the industry's best interest for us to get to a place where we serve the patient's best interest first and foremost, that increases credibility and return sales and stuff like that. And we even have some studies that show that. Interestingly, these problems don't really seem to exist in the pharmacy system, and that's largely because the pharmacies are tightly regulated at the federal level. And so when you go into CVS or whatever your local pharmacy is, and you are going for your blood pressure medication, they're not saying things like, hey, would you like a side of Percocet with that? Right? Why? Do you think they wouldn't if they could? I'm sure they would, but they can't, and so they don't. And I think we need to kind of get something that looks closer to that. And in many ways, I think, we're in this odd position where, because of the politics and the legal sense, we're reinventing the wheel, oftentimes without looking at the pharmacy system as a system that works pretty well. And what lessons can we take from that? One of the fundamental points I think we need to focus on more and more going forward is that patients are not the same as recreational users. They're vastly different groups with different, perfectly legitimate goals. There's nothing about what I'm saying that I want you to take away that Dr. Tishler thinks there's anything wrong with using cannabis for fun. Not at all. But I think that that's a very distinct difference for using it for treating some sort of an illness. Recreational users love the ride, right? That's what they're there for, right? Is how can I use this stuff to have an enjoyable time of it, right? So that leads us to thinking like, what's new and exciting? Oh, I haven't tried a cannabis seltzer yet. Okay. Experimentation is part of the process, part of the fun, right? You go into the dispensary like Planet 13 in Nevada, right? And it's enormous. It's like somebody earlier had said, it's the Disneyland of cannabis, right? It's cool and exciting. And what's new? Totally legit. Possibly slightly more problematic is this idea that if a little is good, a lot is better, right? And, to some extent, there's always this question of, how high can I get? And that's okay on an occasional basis. It may have some medical ramifications down the line, but that's sort of not really the point at the moment. Patients, on the other hand, totally different. They don't want to get high, generally speaking. They want to feel better. They want to go back to normal. They have some sort of an illness or disease that is making them feel crappy, right? And they want to feel like themselves again. They want to get back to life, right? They just want to feel like themselves. The high, it's a side effect, generally speaking. They're looking at this. If I put it this way, if I had a nickel for every patient who came to me and said, "Doc, give me the kind of cannabis that won't get me high," I'd be doing much better than I am. But unfortunately, I have to tell them, look, you know what? THC is the main medicine. It's not the end of the story, but that's the main effector here. And it causes intoxication. That is a side effect. And so this leads us, like with all medications, to seek the minimum effective dose. How little can we use in order to get what we need for the patient without going above that and creating more side effects? And that, that's a big contrast to that recreational model, which is like, how much can I use and still, enjoy it, right? And then we have to recognize that there's a population that is using cannabis in a medical or quasi-medical fashion for, relaxation, anxiety, that sort of thing. And that's fine. But most of the people that I see anyhow have very complex medical conditions with multiple things going on, and they're taking multiple medications. And all of this has to balance in some way that doesn't make them sick and that preferably makes them better, right? What we're going through now in the cannabis industry has analogous roots. We can look at this very much like what was called the patent medicine era of medicine. This is a period of time that started around the end of the Civil War and then continued on until 1934, which is when the FDA was created. And this period of time was typified by lots of unsubstantiated claims about products, either by the seller or the manufacturer. There was no attempt at things like quality control for variability. There was no safety concepts like contamination. And then, of course, there was really no attempt to prove efficacy the way we do with conventional meds now. In 1934, things were so out of hand that the federal government finally did something about it, and they created what's called the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1934, which largely still governs the way we handle pharmaceuticals and prescriptions today. It established safety regulations, it standardized dosing measurements. Ever heard of a dram, right? Probably not. I mean, the point is, it's an antiquated term that has very little utility in our modern way of thinking, but it was one of many units that were out there being used at a time for measuring of various types of therapeutic agents, let's call it that. So we've still, milligrams, much more helpful. It defined what a prescription is. And prescriptions, I wrote thousands of prescriptions before I got into the cannabis industry. And honestly, never really thought much about why they look the way they look. But they are very important. They define not only the medication, but what is the dose, the route, how often somebody's to take it, and how much is to be sold to them by the seller. And this is a very important communication tool. It tells the patient what they're supposed to get and how to use it, and it tells the seller what to give and to sell and how much. We need, I think, to get to something more akin to that in our industry. It established sales limits, which it gets to some of that conflict of interest and misdirection. So this is really what that was all about. So where are they now? I'm sure that you guys are all following this very carefully. I think we all know that until recently, the FDA's position was, look, our hands are tied. We'd love to get into this, but we can't really do much while it's on Schedule 1. It's further complicated by the fact that really they can only make decisions based on data. And we know that there are areas in which there are insufficient data or insufficient quality of data, and that makes it difficult for them to address these things. One of the things I found most interesting was about a year ago, I was privy to a roundtable with the director of the FDA, and basically what he said is, we're horribly underfunded, right? Our mission includes regulations of pharmaceutical medications and food and supplements. And our budget is large for pharmaceuticals is largely funded through the pharmaceutical companies themselves. So we have enough money to be able to do those sorts of things. But when it comes to the part where we're making sure that food is safe, right, and that food additives are safe, that comes from Congress, and we're not getting enough money. And so if we contemplate taking time to regulate CBD or other cannabinoids, that money has to come from somewhere. If it's not coming from the cannabis industry, it has to come from Congress. We're not getting any more money from Congress. That means we have to take it away from food safety. Who wants that, right? So that's an issue. Thankfully, last January, the FDA sort of got off the stick and made a few pronouncements, right? They got off the stick and they said, you know what? These cannabinoids, they're medicines. We want you to go through the medicine pathway. And that includes CBD and other cannabinoids. And I think that one of the things that they did, which was intended to be helpful, was they came out with a document aimed at the cannabis industry saying, this is how you do this. Here are the resources. Here are the requirements. And hopefully that's been helpful to some companies in thinking about how they might step up and follow through those pathways. Unfortunately, I think a lot of what we've done in the interim is fall back on this sort of nutraceutical side of things. In 1994, this very long named act was passed, this Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. And I don't think this was a good thing. Ultimately, it stripped the FDA of regulatory authority other than GMP and post facto enforcement for many of these supplements. It empowered the industry to act really on statements of their own fabrication without any need to prove safety or efficacy. And it's generated, at least at the time that I made the slide a couple of years ago, a $1.64 billion industry. I'm sure that number is only higher now. And what's interesting is that this doesn't have direct application, or it isn't solely limited to the cannabis industry. This is a huge issue when we look at companies like GNC, et cetera, and they sell all of these various supplements, whether it's ginkgo or vitamins or whatever. But if you actually look at the science behind this, there is a government-funded body called the United States Preventive Services Task Force that periodically, annually reviews the data on what are the value here of these substances. And ultimately, what they have concluded time and time again is that unless you have a measurable deficiency in some mineral or vitamin, that supplementation is either useless or in some cases actually harmful. And yet, here we have all of these things continuing to be sold. This model in the cannabis world has been sort of held up as a beacon of how we should be doing things. And it's clearly not in the best interest of our patients. It was rejected by the FDA in January this year. The issue is, of course, Congress, which doesn't seem to be doing much. But if they did something, they could, in fact, override the FDA's authority and force the FDA to put cannabis products into that nutraceutical model. This slide, I think, is something that most of you guys know so well. I think I'm going to whiz through it. But here's the thing. We've got 70 years of research on THC. Not all of it's the best research, but there's a lot of it, and it's reasonably conclusive. We have issues around marketing, different strains. What does this actually mean? Well, when we look at the data, we see that this is not the way that we should be marketing this, because it doesn't lead to significant medical outcome differences. CBD, as we see, has a long road ahead of it to prove efficacy. We've seen issues around its safety with interaction with conventional medications. I've been involved in a number of studies, industry-funded studies on the efficacy of CBD, which unfortunately I have not been able to get published because unfortunately they were negative outcomes and the companies were not happy about that. There's been a lot of discussion about minor terpenes, minor cannabinoids and terpenes. I think there's a lot of really interesting science to be done there yet. But the question is, why are these things on the market now when we don't have definitive information about their safety or their efficacy? I'm going to skip this page. This is really just talking about drug interactions. The current bills, I think the point I want to make here is that the current bills that have been explored over the last 2-3 years have been fundamentally very flawed. The MORE Act, I think we can understand as having been passed multiple times, but really provides no inherent framework or regulatory process for moving this forward. So it's much more about saying, yes, we believe. And that's fine, but it isn't going to get us across the finish line. The Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act certainly had more of a framework to it, but interestingly enough, really didn't focus on medical more than as a passing footnote, and really was focused on tax revenue and some social justice issues, which need to be addressed. But it's interesting to me as a social justice issue that we're ignoring the healthcare aspect, where I at least see healthcare as a fundamental social justice issue. Healthcare is a social justice. Repeating myself, but I think it bears repeating. So what should a federal medical system provide? I think that one of the things, the core of this is that we need to get to a position where we have prescriptions. This allows practitioners to be able to be specific and accurate with their patients, and perhaps equally important, it means that anybody who's writing these prescriptions has to become knowledgeable. They can't just say, oh yeah, here, have a card, right? They have to step up, have specific recommendations, write it down, and be held accountable for that. And I think that that's an important step. It also then communicates to the dispensary and says, look, this is what the patient should get. Please find him this stuff and sell it to him, but don't give him everything else. No shatter, thank you. Unless that's what the prescription were for. Similarly, and this is again to Jackie's point about the overlap between medical systems and recreational systems, we need to get past these medical claims. We have to acknowledge that the dispensaries are really not a place for patients to get medical instruction, and that the dispensaries, frankly, aren't in a position where they really want to be in that, giving medical advice. It's a liability to them, and they're not staffed for it. So let's move that system back towards, we have a dispensing group, the dispensaries, and their job is to have the product and to sell the product and perhaps provide some support around that product, but stopping short of being involved in medical direction. And this we have to acknowledge also occurs on the recreational side, and so we need these issues to be addressed on both sides of the aisle there. We need interstate operability, right? I work here in Boston. Many of my patients go to Florida for the winter, right? What do? Well, either they go without their cannabis medicine, which is inappropriate, Or they pack up their Massachusetts cannabis medicine and drive through, however many states that is, 18 states, breaking the federal law each time they cross a border. Or they go down to Florida and are scrounging around somehow. Now, if I have a patient who goes to Florida and they run out of their blood pressure medicine, they can get a refill in Florida. So why can't my cannabis patients get a refill in Florida, right? We need common safety standards. You know that in Arizona until fairly recently, and in Maine still currently, medical isn't tested, right? How backwards is that? And we can understand the financial and historical reasons for that. But the bottom line is that the medical supply is less safe than the recreational supply. We got to do better than that. And we have to figure out what needs to be tested. I got asked by a lab company recently to weigh in on the question of coliforms, right? Do we need to be testing cannabis for E. coli? Well, it turns out that E. coli is not very hardy, so that if you're going to vaporize or otherwise inhale cannabis, or you're going to manufacture this into something like an edible, E. coli is not really a big concern. So why are we spending a ton of regulatory time and money testing for coliforms? Aspergillus, on the other hand, which is a form of mold, is insanely hardy and insanely dangerous to human beings, and many states don't test for it at all. And there's also debate about, how to test for it and what's the best method and all that stuff. So we need to amalgamate these approaches and figure out what's really important and do that without fail, and then figure out what's sort of been boogeymen and kind of do away with that. You're all probably aware that every state has come up with these lists of conditions for which patients can be approved or not, which I think is a silly thing, right? Again, we need clinicians to step up, to work to their degree, right? And to say, yeah, pain can be treated. So it doesn't matter whether it's osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis or, post-surgical pain. As a clinician, I understand that this works and is legitimate, and I'm going to write this prescription, and it doesn't have to fit on a list that is generated through some sort of odd political process. And it's an odd political process, and we know this because, for example, glaucoma is on every one of those lists, and it has a long history. But it turns out that cannabis is a lousy medicine for glaucoma compared to conventional medicines. Look, if we didn't have anything else for glaucoma, sure, we could use it. But the thing is, we know that THC will lower intraocular pressure, which is the fundamental problem in glaucoma, but it only does it for a couple hours, right? Which means you'd have to smoke some weed every couple hours, round the clock, even at 3 or 4 in the morning when you're supposed to be asleep, or you lose your vision. Compare that to a conventional medicine where twice a day you put a couple drops in your eye and you're done, right? So the list of conditions need to be removed, I think, and we need to follow medical evidence and put that onus on the clinician. In Massachusetts, we have more flexibility than in many other states because our law says, here's a list of 8 conditions, but it also is applicable to any or all other severe and debilitating conditions determined by the clinician. That, in my mind, demotes those 8 conditions to examples, right? This is what we were thinking about, but anything else that kind of falls in line with that, we're good with that. And I think that that's really where we need to get to. And this really points out that none of the states have done this really very well, but certain states have gotten bits and pieces right, and that we need to kind of learn from and extract, and I call it sort of the greatest hits of the states. Purchase feedback. You guys have probably heard of the PDMP systems where physicians are required to look up and make sure that patients are buying the medicines appropriately and such like that, particularly for benzos and opioids. In Massachusetts, we have a similar sort of thing. I can see what my patients are buying. I'd like a little bit more granularity in terms of what information is fed back to me, but this is insanely useful to me so that when I have a patient who says, yeah, doc, I'm taking a 5 milligram gummy at bedtime just like you told me to, but I see that they've been buying 6 pounds of weed. In addition, I can say, hey, what's going on? Why don't we talk about it? Oh, well, I'm sharing with my brother-in-law. That actually is the good news, because at least it's not going into them. But I say, you know, okay, fine, and it's just between you and me, but remember, this is not totally kosher. We need to acknowledge that there is overlap between the medical and recreational markets, and we need to separate them as best we can. This gets right back to my statements about those medical claims. We don't want people going to a recreational store for their back pain medicine and then missing the opportunity for the care that's necessary. And it hasn't happened publicly yet, but we know it's going to come, that there's going to be somebody out there who goes to the dispensary, one side of the aisle or the other, for their back pain for 6 or 12 months, only to find out that their back pain was metastatic prostate cancer, right? And now that cat's out of the bag. Whereas if they had seen a doc up front or a clinician, then they might have gotten a proper diagnosis sooner and saved their lives or prolonged their lives. And lastly, and I think this is kind of the no-brainer, we have a lot of data at this point, and to poo-poo that is wrong, but we also have to recognize that, like every field, including cardiology, there is certainly much more to be learned, and we need to step up and put our money where our mouth is. I'm looking mostly at the federal government and NIH when I say this, and say, you know what? Scrounge up $1 billion, stop whining about the fact that we don't have enough data, and start funding some large multi-center randomized controlled trials so we can get the information and then treat patients and form regulation correctly on that basis. We briefly mentioned the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists. This is this not-for-profit that I started years ago. And I should just point out that our Vice President of Finance is here, James Winokur. And our goal here is to advance patient care through the betterment of the system. So it's a lot of advocacy, it's a lot of education. We have continuing medical education available for clinicians of all stripes, as well as for bud tenders, and a whole bunch of sort of deeper dive a la carte coursework that people can participate in. There's a lot of opportunity through networking to meet with colleagues, and we do a lot of mentoring so that we can help newer clinicians feel more comfortable taking care of their patients. So if you have interest in this, you can certainly let me know. You can visit us on the web at cannaspecialist.org, and we can talk more about them. And this is my last slide. Thank you all for listening. Basically, this is to just provide email address for me, as well as if you have any particular reason to go to my practice website, InhaleMD, that's there as well. So thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
We have an opportunity for Q&A. So Karen's walking around with the mic.
All right. Cool. Awesome. Great talk. Could not agree more with pretty much everything you've said. I walked in a few minutes late, but this is great. So question though, I think it's an important point about the appropriations, back to the different bills that have come up, and whether it's the FDA or you just mentioned NIH, NIDA, you name it, there is no funding for any of this work to happen. Essentially. So I think about the industry trade groups and pushing for safe banking, MORE Act, et cetera. Would you argue that the focus should really be directed back to what you're talking about here and focusing on, if the FDA wants data, states need data, physicians need data to make informed decisions to recommend products, that you should be pushing bills through Congress and lobbying for them that actually provide funding to do this fundamental research to take advantage of the credibility needed?
Absolutely. I think the other thing is that oftentimes in the hierarchy of priorities that we would like to see Congress push forward, there's sort of this zero-sum concept, right? Well, we could do safe banking or we could put some money aside for research. If Congress would do more, there's no reason that we can't do all of these things simultaneously. I think safe banking is hugely important. in terms of progress for the industry and the safety of the workers in the industry, there's no reason we have to put that to the side to say what you're saying, which is, yeah, and while we're doing that, why don't we start putting that $1 billion into research? It's a little bit disingenuous to me to have a federal government saying, no, we're not going to move this off Schedule 1, wherever that might go, because there's not enough data, without their turning around and saying, well, if there's not enough data, let's put some money into it, get the data that we need. We could spend that $1 billion, and we, all of us in this room, could turn out to be vastly shocked that after we do these really big and well done studies, turns out that cannabis is a joke, right? I don't think we would see that. But the point is that if we do the research in a sound manner, we have to be open to any outcome that is legitimately created. And I think that, it kind of goes back to this question. Sometimes people say to me, Doc, are you for or against cannabis? And I say, I'm not for or against cannabis. I'm for my patients, right? So if cannabis is a useful and safe medication for treating my patients, then yeah, let's do it. If it turns out to be unsafe in some fashion, then we need to know that too. I mean, that's part of my general view about CBD, right? And I'm sure that most of you guys probably think I'm anti-CBD. I'm not anti-CBD. I think we need more data, right? We've got some data that shows, first of all, that it's absolutely useful and supported for treatment of Dravet's and Lennox-Gastaut syndromes, right? We also have data to show that it interacts with conventional medicine, so that's not a red flag, that's a yellow flag, right? We have data that it can cause direct liver toxicity. Again, yellow flag, that means the clinician has to be clued in enough to say, all right, if we're gonna use this medicine, then we need to test your liver function periodically and make sure you're doing okay. Right? That kind of information needs more generations. So yes, Congress, I think, needs to stick money into this problem so that we get the answers. I don't actually care what the answers are. We just have to get them. Thank you for that. Surely I must have offended more of you guys that you want to ask questions in the... I mean,
why is the money? I mean, it's the states that are currently collecting tax money from cannabis, but in the state of Massachusetts, we devote 0% of that money to research. Flush it down the toilet, putting it all into the CCC. So, how do we get states to start grant programs?
Actually, many of the states, including Massachusetts, have grant programs, and we've seen a number of...
Massachusetts doesn't have an open grant program.
Open, and what does that mean?
It doesn't. There aren't like there's no there are no calls for open calls for research.
Okay,
right.
I actually don't know the details of that, so I don't
do occasional RFRs, but they're like contracts.
Yeah, right. And so to your point, I think we could do better. There are other states that are doing better. Pennsylvania, Michigan come to mind. Where California? Okay.
California has a fund.
Right.
Yeah.
The bottom line is I'm not really going to disagree with you about this. I think that states have a slightly more difficult proposition in that, number one, they may be drawing some revenue from the cannabis industry, but they don't have a ton of other free cash to kind of pool with it to achieve the kinds of money, the number of dollars that are necessary to really do these big studies. And they also generally don't have either the expertise or the person power to kind of go down that road. At least when we think about the way research is done in the United States in a sort of more conventional sense, it's funded and directed through the federal government.
Yeah, 98%.
Yeah. So, and then also through industry, right? But most of the research that comes out on the industry side is funded through a pharmaceutical company that has to do that research in order to get through the FDA process in order to go to market. And so that's actually a good thing because the FDA is gatekeeping and the companies are paying for that gatekeeping, so it's not all on the taxpayers. The problem in the cannabis industry, and I've been through this countless times with various companies that have approached me to help them over the years, is that when they say to me things like, we really want to be a medical company, we want to be forward thinking, we want to do the research, and I say, that's great, sign me right up. And then they say, great, what should we research? And I always say pain. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And then they say, what do we have to do and how much is it going to cost? And I say, well, we could probably start out at about $10 million and it's probably going to work up to 50, just for the first set of studies. But, by the time we're done, it's probably closer to $1 billion. And, their eyes glaze over. And part of it is that those are big numbers, but part of it also, and I think this is a legitimate issue, is why would you spend a cent proving anything if you don't have to, the way the drug companies have to prove it in order to get to market, right? And so if your choice is you can market a tincture as a medical product without actually doing the research, why would you spend that kind of money? And the answer is you won't. And so, in some ways, in order for us to get where we need to be, we actually have to make things more tighter, more regulated, but also fund it, right? And so kind of it's a give and take, both hands. So.
Michelle, I just want to check in. Robert, ask you for a second. Do you have any questions from Zoom?
Yes, this is from Carla. Dr. Tishler, have you compiled a state's medical marijuana program's greatest hits list? If not, do you know of one done by anyone else? She is in Tennessee, and it would be really nice to start off our future program with the best program possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. I know Carla. She used to work for ACS before she got too busy. And she always asks great questions. Yes, essentially, there is a document that the ACS has put together that lives on our website, which has, got this long name like the ACS's recommendations for federal medical legalization or something like that. And the bottom line is it really is the greatest hits of the states. It's a very high level document. It doesn't prescribe the implementation. It describes what are the necessary ingredients, much of which I listed on that slide: prescriptions, moratorium on medical claims, interoperability, safety standards, those sorts of things. The next step, which is, I think, important, but has to be a certain political will, is to translate those aspirational goals into something that looks like a bill. And I think that the time is getting to the point where that was the next step, but we have to get there. And if anybody in the room is interested in working on that sort of thing, I would welcome the support. So, yes.
In the interest of time, I'm going to look behind Robin. One last question.
Would you mind, I'm not sure if people in our, not just general audience, could you just briefly speak to some of the studies that came out from, that have come out of Israel? Dr. Meshulam, decades old, but I know a lot of the research started in Israel going back into the 60s, early 70s with cannabis, and unfortunately has not translated. A lot of those studies people are not aware of them. But the whole setup, as everything is here, a lot of research is funded by certain groups. And unfortunately, a lot of times with your more traditional pharmacy products, you can pretty much put a study together and have the results come out the way that you want them to. Not so much with this, just kind of a comment, not really a question.
Yeah, your question comment really does point to the fact that there are a lot of studies out there, many of which are good. And in many ways now, having fast forwarded the 12 or so years, we've got 35,000 studies in PubMed. It's very difficult to synthesize something coherent from that. And in fact, that is, again, part of the ACS mission, is that clinicians shouldn't have to go through this crazy process that I went through all those years ago. Now we've put it together in a fashion that is digestible. A lot of the early stuff from Dr. McCullum and colleagues was extraordinarily seminal, right? They not only figured out what THC and CBD looked like, but then they figured out what the receptors were, and really have allowed us to understand that there is an endocannabinoid system, and it's not just dope, right? That there's a real process here, and like any medication, we can find chemicals, in this case phytocannabinoids, where we can use them to intervene in an existing system. I often say, look, you know what? The endocannabinoid system is wonderful and complex, and this is why cannabis works, as compared to alcohol, which is basically just a poison. It's, I always say, yeast poop, right? And the thing is, if you drink a little bit of it, it doesn't poison you, but it kind of starts to poison you, and some people like that. If you drink too much of it, it'll really poison you, and that's not so good. The other thing that's really interesting in terms of the data that's coming out of Israel is some of the more modern stuff that Dedi Meri is doing at Technion, which is really, I think, paving the way for our understanding of many of the chemicals beyond THC and CBD that exist in the plant, and that perhaps not directly from the plant, but ultimately through a process of human ingenuity on top of the lessons we learn from the plant, may lead to drugs that are better chemotherapeutic agents than what we have now, or extend our abilities in that realm. So yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff going on. It turns out, and this was a surprise to me, that if you ask the question, which country produces the most cannabis research? Anybody want to take a guess at that? It's not Israel. It's not Germany, and it's not Canada. It's the United States, right? Stunning. And I wouldn't necessarily say all of the equal caliber, but the point is that despite all of the roadblocks that we know so well, we're still turning out research and still moving the ball down the field. We just want to do better and faster, and I think we can. So thank you all today.